It's my great pleasure to welcome you all back, and I'm really excited to be joined by Dean Lee, the president of Merck Research Labs. And Dean, I've gotten to know you a lot over the past decade, and I want the audience to get to know you as well. So I came up with some rapid fire, kind of one-word answer questions. So we're going to start off with your favorite book.
My favorite book, Maniotis's Manual of Molecular Biology.
Oh, that is a nerdy answer. Next one, most impactful medicine.
Penicillin.
Okay. If you could be any animal, or if you were any animal, what animal would you be?
After just watching Kung Fu Panda, it just comes to my mind that it has to be a panda. But I don't resemble anything about the Kung Fu Panda. I probably resemble the really small person. I can't remember what animal they were.
Yeah, like the snake or something.
Yeah.
Okay, so a couple more. Movie of your life, who plays Dean Lee? Besides Will Ferrell, because he's playing me.
I'd like to think it would be Jet Li, but we'll see.
Okay. Favorite superhero?
Oh, it's actually Thor right now.
Okay. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Favorite food?
Chinese food.
Okay.
Yeah.
And favorite restaurant?
Favorite restaurant? R&G Lounge in San Francisco.
Okay, and since we are here in the BioHive, your favorite Utah restaurant?
Chuckarama.
All right, there it is. I knew I had to get that out. Awesome.
It's actually either Chuckarama or Crown Burger.
Crown Burger, that's right. So now that everybody knows you really well, Dean, knows you as well as I do, I want to get a little bit personal. And I want to start with your childhood. And so lean back on the couch, put your feet up. Tell me about your childhood and what in your childhood made you who you are now and led you down this path to be the president of Merck Research Labs.
Well, if any of your audience ever seen John Oliver, John Oliver has this an episode on Asian American, and he actually plays a clip from a government television script, and it actually is me, but it's exactly opposite of my story.
This is you when you were eight or nine?
Eight or nine.
Yep.
And I come from I would say a very Asian family. It was really emphasizing academics, doing well in school, and it wasn't just my parents who taught me. I was the youngest. I have a brother and two sisters who you try to keep up. And they are hard to keep up with. And so my whole life is trying to keep up with them, but also they're brothers and sisters who've actually invested in me as much as my parents. And that's true even today. So I've been very lucky. I've had brothers and sisters and parents who shepherded me and coached me through literally every segment of my life. Not just high school, I mean college, I mean medical school, internship, residency, throughout.
That's great. So now you are the equivalent of the CSO of Merck. And when I came to the University of Utah and I was talking to you about joining your lab, someone close to you said that you were an enigma because you did not want to win a Nobel Prize. You wanted to be the CSO of Merck.
Well, it's actually an interesting story because I had a great postdoc mentor. His name was Mark Keating. He's actually quite well known for having discovered lots of genes for human diseases, and also then moving on to Boston Children's and then Novartis. And when I was interviewing him, he asked me who is my favorite scientist, like this one. Sort of thing, and he thought I was going to come up with different scientists, and I looked at him. And
you said Mark Keating.
I didn't say Mark Keating, although Mark Keating is a great scientist. I said Roy Vagelos, and then that's where the question came up with, okay, so how do you think about science and technology, most people coming into these labs are thinking about being in the National Academy of Science and getting a Nobel Prize. But I really admired Roy Vagelos. Roy Vagelos had been at WashU in St. Louis. That's where I trained, and his motto was something that you were trained to aspire to. Someone who deeply understood science, deeply understood technology, not just for today, but the sort of trajectory of science and technology, and understood that the culmination of science and technology is to change human lives and to actually do that. And so that was always my aspiration. And I remember Mark Keating say, wow, I've asked that question. I don't know anyone's have answered it with such specificity. But when he asked me, I said, Roy Vagelos. And just to let you know, when I was being recruited to Merck, one of the biggest pleasures of my life during the recruitment that Roger Perlmutter and Joe Miletich and Roy Baines, all of them arranged for me to actually hang out with Roy Vagelos.
I didn't know that. That's
Yes.
amazing. I bet that was pretty cool.
That was very cool.
Well, congratulations. You're in this role now coming up on a year. What is the essence of this role at Merck? What is it that you do?
When you're at a company like Merck, you have an enormous amount of power. You have just think about a car with a lot of cylinders. And when you press the accelerator, and I'm saying this to you because you would appreciate this more than anyone else, you can hear it rumble. And you have power on the hood. But with that power comes a degree of responsibility. What you do is you feel an enormous amount of responsibility that the world has aggregated resources in certain companies like Merck, Novartis, Roche, but they've done it with the expectation that we can invent drugs that fundamentally change the trajectory of medicine. And that's what the social contract is. So it's very hard to do that. And you get a sense of deep responsibility. I know that people think about it from a corporate standpoint in this, but when you walk the halls of Merck, and I would imagine you walk the halls of these other big pharma, sometimes people view that as this big conglomeration, you feel a sense of presence of the people who came before and who did change that trajectory. And many of us work physician scientists. We know that if these companies don't do that, the human condition will be less than what it can be. And so you feel this enormous, I don't know if weight is the right word, but responsibility would be the right word.
So how do you harness all of that horsepower, all of that weight, that mission to get the best out of the people that are working for you and working for patients at Merck or anywhere else? What's the advice you'd have for all of us?
Right. I mean, I think about things in sort of three buckets in terms of what you have to sort of manage. You have to understand in some degree a sense of what the trajectory of it is in biology. You have to have a sense of what the trajectory is in terms of technology. And you have to have a sense of what can be proven. It's often viewed that you discover a drug, you have to make a really good molecule. But you have to be very thoughtful how you take that molecule out for a lap around the track, which is the clinical development. Mm-hmm. And the science involved in doing human biology experiments at scale is critically important. But you add all of that, and what you have to do is inspire people. Why would you come to a large pharmaceutical company? Is that you need everyone focused, that you need all three things. But as I often say at Merck, the only exit that we have at Merck is to fundamentally change what happens to patients throughout the world.
So I'm going to shift gears slightly to a moment I remember pretty deeply when I was sitting at my lab bench in your lab. And up on my hutch in the lab. I think it was from the New York Times. I had a reminder to me of a choice I made early in life to follow science, and I chose not to go to the military, which is something I was considering. And I had this reminder of that with soldiers that had died in Iraq and Afghanistan. I don't know if you remember what you said to me. You might guess what you said, and I'm wondering if you can talk about that analogy of what you told me at the time, to remember that we are fighting a war. We're fighting a war against disease. And tell me about that analogy, how that works for you, how you think about that.
Yeah, the reason why that played a little bit of a different tone for me is, as you know, and maybe your audience doesn't know, I actually didn't meet you first. I met your wife first. And I met her, I used to attend in the sort of telemetry ICU
This is getting
at
awkward. You met my wife first.
Veterans Administration and also at the University of Utah. And that's when you feel what it's like to be a doctor when you're in the ICU, when you're in telemetry, and you recognize how much medicine can do, but you also recognize how limited we are in medicine. And you run into people who have given truly, have put themselves out in a way that I can honestly say I haven't given to this country. And I think you remember I would attend, and it changes.
You would attend specifically at the VA.
I attend at the VA and the university,
Yep.
but especially at the VA. You know, those are, you know, you think about every decision you make. You think about every decision you wish you had made, and every decision that you wish you had to come, that you had a second term on. But what you also recognize is there is a view that all the great medicines and discoveries that need to happen have already happened. And therefore, what we have to worry about is simply making sure that that gets distributed. I don't know that people understand how much we don't know about medicine, how much we don't know about science. And the greatest unmet need is in patients who have no medicines. And you feel in a palpable way when you're attending. And so when one thinks about what we're supposed to do, I come back to that. And more recently, you know, I was near New York City. You and I had a mutual friend who was attending there. He would send missives out and that's when you understand, wow, what we need to do for it's our responsibility. It's no longer a profession of what we're interested in doing. It's truly a responsibility. And if we don't do it, and if we don't do it better every decade, then we would have lost our social contract for why people are so interested in what you do, what I do, and the decisions that we make.
So, operating at the VA, there's a certain kind of culture. Operating in an academic setting at the University of Utah, there's a certain kind of culture. Transitioning now, still early in your career, I'm sure,
Yes.
to Merck, there's a certain kind of culture. One thing I always appreciated about you, Dean, was your ability to understand the ways that people were motivated and how to influence and align them in pursuit of a goal. Talk a little bit about how you understand the culture of a place and how you operate within it.
I don't know if I've actually thought so clearly through it, but I've been asked at Merck what was the most important experience for me to be successful at Merck, and I do have to say it is the fact that I was at an academic medical center. I was able to run a lab, spin out companies with you and other people, but also be very involved with a clinical enterprise. I was in a situation where every academic department and every school within the health system reported to me. And what you get is you get a rich complexity of how different people think about a common mission. So the individuals at an academic medical center, they often talk about a trifecta mission, but really it's one mission. They all want to split in different sort of ways. And the critical thing is you have to understand what piece they see, but you also have to somehow knit them to a commonness. I mean, I'll just put it out there. You need to connect the surgeon and the Department of Surgery to understand how important the work that he or she did and how important the work that they did is important for us to invest in the Department of Biochemistry, and how investing in the School of Medicine is important, but also investing in the School of Nursing. And it's trying to understand each person's perspective, but trying to find what that common thread that you can knit them as a unit together, so that you don't lose their diversity, but you also don't have it so diverse that there isn't a common aim in front of you. And so when you look at making a medicine at Merck, you have so many different divisions outside of Merck Research Labs, but within Merck Research Labs, you have many, many departments. It is reminiscent of the considerations that I've had to have when I was at an academic medical center, thinking about the academic side, the operational side, thinking about laboratory developed test of ARUP. So I was very lucky to be at the University of Utah, where it was not too big, but also not too small, and it allowed me to have a richness of experience without diluting myself too much. And that experience is what has served me well at a complex organization such as Merck.
How has that transition been, coming from academics into not only a large pharma company, but one that has, I think, as you sort of mentioned earlier, a lot of the great history of the industry standing at its feet? So
it's really not that different in what you have to accomplish. You think in terms of everywhere you go, you think about what are the major ingredients that you have to get something done. People, time, space, dollars, and you need to be able to mobilize them, not just mobilize them, but lead them with inspiration, with rigor, with entrepreneurship. It's all of that together to a final goal. And in order to be successful, there are always two ingredients. The people who work with you, it's just like my success at the University of Utah was built on graduate students and postdocs that you know their names. My success in Utah was built on working with department chairs such as Wes Sundquist, such as John Hoyto, and I have the same sort of thing at Merck. And my success at Merck is no different than the success I had in an academic medical center, where those people over me actually mentored and tutored me. So Roger Perlmutter, Roy Baines in charge of clinical, Joe Militich, who's in charge of all of discovery, they essentially brought me in. And I remember essentially what they did is it was internship residency all over, except instead of the rotation being, once a month, they were in 6 months splits. But what I will say is, just like internship residency, you're on call every third and every fourth, it is like being on call every third and fourth. And so I had great people to mentor me, and that's true in any place that you go. I would not have had this opportunity if it hadn't been for Roger, Joe, Roy, and let me just tell you, it would not have been this case. I had worked with one of the most iconic CEOs ever, not just at Merck, ever, in Ken Frazier.
Tell me a little bit about that, going off script here. Tell me about Ken. Tell me about what that was like to get to work with somebody who has created such an important legacy.
It's hard to put in words, but you understand why people gravitate to him. So I've always wondered about why, for example, Roger Perlmutter, he was at Amgen, and why would he come back to Merck? Being in these positions is great, it's exciting, but it is not without a price. And Roger had he had accomplished so much at Amgen. And I never quite understood it. I've understood Roger a little bit more. He's perpetually hungry and interested in the next thing. But the other thing that I understood is why he would come, because there are few times you get to work with someone as inspirational as Ken Frazier. It's hard to put in words, but when you're just get a quick phone call, it's filled with a passion. Here you have a lawyer, a trained lawyer who comes from the inner city of Philadelphia, who had an educational experience that allowed him to have this incredible impact on the world, and who knows the difference between his story and not that story is chance. Mm-hmm. And when you meet someone who understands that and understands how important what you do, there's just a vibrancy. And oftentimes people talk about, and he puts it in this way, it's very difficult for people to understand that a large company can truly have a soul, but it can only have, the reason a large company can have a soul is when you meet a leader like Ken Frazier. So it was hard to turn down leaving academics, leaving some of the startup companies that I was involved with. But when you have this opportunity to work and learn from someone like Ken, to be mentored by someone like Roger, to be guided day by day by someone like Joe Militage, to be able to understand how do you do human biology experiments at scale by Roy Baines, you just sit there. I've just laid out, the Fantastic Four being someone who trains you. You can't, you
take that.
These things don't happen often in people's lives.
Amazing. So let's go back to some specific points. About 2 years ago, a little less than 2 years ago, I remember being on a phone call with you, talking about what felt like the potential for a pandemic, talking about how we at Recursion would react, how you all would react. Take us back to the decisions that you and the Fantastic Four were making at Merck. And you know where I'm going. I'm going to ask you some questions about, a medicine that looks to have, from my perspective, a lot of potential as a treatment for COVID-19, and some recent data out in the last several weeks. Talk to me about the decisions you all made then to pursue a therapeutic strategy as opposed to a vaccine strategy, or what was happening in your minds?
So I should say that I think my laboratory actually worked on acute lung injury, actually was funded by the NIH, actually was a lab in the NIAID, the institute that Anthony Fauci leads. He actually had a biodefense network. We were in that. We actually got funding from the Department of Defense in relationship to this. And some of the pathways where we were looking for how could you modulate the immune regulation such that when someone had a viral pandemic, that we wouldn't treat the virus, but we would treat the immune response. And so when the pandemic started happening, that experience having actually been doing research sort of kicks in. I think that Merck felt a deep responsibility not to make a choice. I mean, in some sense, we did not make a choice. In some sense, what we recognized is that we have a responsibility. The world aggregated a lot of resources to us, especially off the backs of what we have been able to do in immuno-oncology and changing that. And the view was, we're not going to pick. We are going to do vaccines, we are going to do a therapeutic, and we're also going to do an immune modulatory. And as those programs were advancing, and other people were being successful in different component parts, the relative need of what you have to do needs to change. And I just want to call out to everyone the biopharmaceutical industry as a whole. I think many companies, many biotech companies, many biopharmaceutical companies, what they did is they had an expertise, they grabbed it, and they refocused it. There has been a lot of success for it, but it was the fact that you had that rich tapestry of different companies who came at it different ways. Our approach to vaccines was different than other people's approach. We were worried that you would need constant boosters, that you needed a single dose, you needed something that 4 degrees or better, and so that's what we tried to make. Ultimately, the other approaches were extremely efficacious, and at that point you look and you say, well, what's the unmet need? Mm-hmm. So we were committed to having impact in any way that we can. The issue in relationship to treatment, lots of companies ran to their group and looking at protease inhibitors and this, we did the same, but we thought that a pandemic was also a useful time to test a mechanism that previously had not been tested. So as horrible as a pandemic is, when you have such an unmet need, it gives you an opportunity to test scientific experiments in humans that you could never test any other time. And so it's that emergence that led to what has happened more recently in our work that has been done in collaboration with Ridgeback and with Emory University as well.
Well, we're thankful for all that work. I want to talk about Monerovir.
Yes.
And I know it's a little bit challenging for you, given the interactions with the regulatory agencies, to talk about the medicine and the data. So instead, I want you to talk about the name.
Yes. So I have never been more popular to my adult kids and their friends than the clinical trial success we have with Monerovir, because Monerovir is named after Thor's hammer.
Mjolnir.
And the concept is that this is a medicine that we've only proved it for SARS-CoV-2, mm-hmm. but if you look at the basic science principles, COVID-19 allowed us to prove it for SARS-CoV-2, but there are many other respiratory viruses, such as RSV, influenza, other coronaviruses, where by basic principles, you would imagine that should those become a pandemic, that maybe this medicine might, by first principle, hasn't been proven, could be effective. Mm-hmm. And so SARS-CoV-2 allowed us to ask that question. You need a pandemic to give you that opportunity to do that. And we thought that we, as a company who had expertise in viruses and HIV, for example, needed to take that expertise and apply it here. And the data that we've had in relationship to clinical trial that is public is that the data looked so positive in the trial that we had that we stopped the trial. Oftentimes, you don't get to stop a trial because your external independent data safety monitoring board and the FDA come to you and say, you can no longer really randomize patients to placebo and treatment. That does not happen often. And so for that reason, and in consultation with them, we stopped the trial. Clearly, the regulatory process has to go through its formal. They need to intensely look at every piece of data. So their advice to us was to stop the trial, and now we're rapidly trying to get all the information that they need to make a thoughtful decision.
Thank you for that work, regardless of the outcome. I'm excited to see where it goes. I want to just switch gears one more time to a question we skipped earlier, but I want to come back to. You know, in board meetings, you and I sometimes have discussions around diversity and inclusion. And it's an important area for BioHive, but it's an important area to do right. And I think it would be interesting for folks to hear your perspective on how do you create a culture and an environment where diverse perspectives can flourish, and how do you harness those diverse perspectives to advance a mission, be it taking a medicine to fight SARS-CoV-2, be it to build a new ecosystem. Talk a little bit about that.
I think sometimes people separate the concept of diversity and inclusion from the concept of just pure, naked excellence, as if they're two opposing views. I get concerned when we speak about diversity and inclusion without that lens. You know, probably one of the most interesting conversation I had was in academic medical center. I had a position that I think you know was relatively high up, and I remember being involved with hiring a woman who's African American who didn't have Utah roots as a physician, and getting to know her. And it was so funny because everyone wanted to talk to her about how she could be involved with all these activities in relationship to diversity and inclusion, which she wanted to do. But she said the most poignant thing to me that I've always remembered, where she actually said something to me, which is, what I also want is to have, you know, oftentimes because you have a certain position in a hospital system, you interact with a certain clientele, a high-end clientele who are donors. And she actually had said something to the effect of, I'm committed to diversity and inclusion and trying to do this, but there's a part of me that also wants to have your clientele of my patient list. And that's when I recognize sometimes when we do diversity and inclusion, we actually do it in a way that limits what we're trying to get people to aspire to. So when I look at it, what I look for is unvarnished excellence, but unvarnished excellence from different intellectual perspectives. And with the rapid acceleration of data and science and technology, I mean, you just look at the number of modalities, different types of medicines that have come to pass just over the last 5-10 years. It's unbelievable. And what you recognize is new generations have to take the wheel. I view myself as sort of a transitional generation. You were in my lab. You guys were trying to teach me how to use email. I mean, let's just understand some of the difficulty I had whenever you guys used
Email.
Adobe, which isn't Utah. I'm not the most facile. But what I recognize is your group really was that first group who understood really, I knew theoretically what it meant. You guys were built on it. But you guys were also built on it at a stage where you understood there was a generation that didn't have it. And so the responsibility for individuals like you is you're going to have a generation that you have to make way for who never knew what this other generation, who never had all of this, could really accomplish. And so I view I view it almost, I was raised in a very Chinese family. I know all the dynasties of China. I know which dynasty was named after my family name. I know what are the most emperors. It's the same sort of thing, that each generation needs to leave something for another generation. And the minute you allow that, and you think through this, you think about the generation before me. What does their medical school class, what does their undergraduate class look like? What does my medical school and undergraduate? When I was an intern, it was highly unlikely to see a woman in cardiology. Then you look at your academic generation, it's different. And then we look at the other ones. And so one of the things that I just think that we have to do is that the older generations have to understand what the younger generations, that imprint that they have that is different. And in some sense, we need to make room for that. And by doing that, oftentimes that will naturally lead to demographic diversity, simply because the gender, the ethnicity is changing in the school systems. And that's what will allow us to really get true demographic diversity, but not instead of excellence, but in the name of excellence.
Thank you. Last two questions. With the gifts of the generation that preceded you, your generation, my generation, and the ones coming behind, what do you see as the largest opportunities in healthcare where we're going to make the biggest impacts in the next decade or so? Where do you place your bets?
I think there might be 2 points of view that I would come. First is we have to make new medicines faster, better, cheaper than what we have done in the past. There are so many unmet needs that have yet to be met because we haven't harnessed science and technology well enough. The other point of view that I would just look is that I come from a company that has more than a century of experience, deep experience in relationship to knowing how and learning how to make medicines. And the way to think about making medicines is, in many ways, it's a university. It's a liberal arts of science. You have to have certain type of biology. You have to have certain types of pharmacology. You have to have certain types of chemistry. You have to do this. You have to get it all the way through. Clinical development, how do you think? How do you think about statistics? So in many ways, it's many departments. So this analogy that I have about an integrated medical center is not so far away from what you need to make a medicine. But the wealth of information and the speed with which that information is changing is dramatically changing. And you look at a company like Merck. We've been in business 130 years, right? But really the most vital piece of information and data that is important for today, we have that history of 50 years or 70 years, but the exponential growth just in the last 10 years is the most important pieces of information. Moving forward, you see that just accelerating. So how we really use data and information and the richness of it, and also understanding the biases within it, is going to be something that is possible to capture. Instead of transmitting information through serial PowerPoint, which is how we did it in lab, right? That's how lab meetings was serial PowerPoints. And I remember, how we scored things, right? And you and I had vociferous conversations of, the observer is truly, even when they're blinded, they're not really blinded. You just think of what the information technology can do in every aspect of these disciplines, and the rapid change in that, and the ability to curate, collate, connect. is very different. But as we do it, those people who are, for example, Recursion or at Merck, I always remind people that every piece of data is biased. So you have to understand that you're putting all of this together. But I really think that that revolution is going to change how biotech operates. That's the dream of Recursion, and that's the dream of Merck. And so our ability to synthesize that over the next 10 to 15, 20 years, I hope has a transformative impact.
And more broadly, if you look beyond therapeutics and you look at healthcare, society, political, economic, stability or instability, what concerns you most from the perspective of healthcare over the coming decades? And for someone who's, I'm sure, 5 or 6 watching this at home, looking up to you, who wants to change the world in 20 or 30 years, what are those massive problems that we need to be thinking about decades in advance that you and I are not going to play a major role in shifting?
So, clearly, things outside of science, healthcare is clearly, we are a world that increasingly needs energy. And we're not going to constrain our energy use. In order to have the advances in technology that need to change these fields, we're going to need the technology. We're here in Recursion. There's a lot of energy that needs to be used to do this. And so the concept of how we think about energy and clean energy will be critically important. And for my grandkids that have yet to come, and this is a hint to my children, that's something that I think is critically important. But in relationship to healthcare and in relationship to science and technology and its impact on healthcare, clearly our ability to not just invent drugs, but to invent drugs and have them widely available, because the efficiency with which the insight with which we can do what was impossible, but the efficiency to do it in a way that makes that impossible attainable and touchable to a larger population will be critically important. There are 2 ways to look at it. There's nothing better for society to do than to spend it on people's health. But at the same time, when the spend in health sort of pushes out other investments, such as in education, such as in the environment, that's when the clarion call for our industry to do it better, faster, cheaper is upon our generation, so that our next generations can really exploit what they can do. So it's really our ability to bend that innovation curve in relationship to discovering new drugs that can change the human condition and remove human suffering, so that people and populations can think of things greater than just my health today. So that's a huge challenge, and it seems insurmountable, but every generation, every era, it seems like for some reason humans have been able to rise to that, and I hope we can do that again.
Well, we better get to work.
Yes,
Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it, Dean.
All right, thank you.